to go. Hello, I'm Brian Stevens from the Edmonton Nature Club, and I'm pleased to have Brenda Dale, the Alberta BBS coordinator, who's going to do a presentation on the breeding bird surveys in Alberta. So I'll hand it off to Brenda, who can fill you in on her background.
Thank you, Brian. So I did my master's work on grassland bird habitat selection, and after a few years of shorter term work, I got my position with Canadian Wildlife Service, and my position was a songbird biologist for all three prairie provinces, and my main jobs were to do with supporting and promoting volunteer monitoring, and then also looking at the response of grassland birds to agricultural, industrial, and conservation practices. So that's what I did for my career. I'm retired now, but I still am involved with the breeding bird survey. I have the difficult task of following in the footsteps of Jack Park, who was the best breeding bird survey in any province had. He was fantastic. And so I was a bit nervous about taking it over, but anyway, I'm doing my best. And part of what I'm doing, what I like to do is to talk to people about what the breeding bird survey can do and how important it is for bird conservation. So that's my purpose here tonight. So I do want to put the spotlight on the breeding bird survey and what it does for bird conservation. But I also want to talk a little bit about some of the other surveys and how they help in bird conservation. My purpose obviously is to encourage people to participate in the breeding bird survey, but also it's to acknowledge the current participants, because we often put a lot of effort into getting people to participate in things, but we don't often spend enough time acknowledging what they've done and thanking them for what they've done. And I hope that tonight will help a bit to make people realize how important this volunteer effort is. So the content of the talk, I am going to speak a little bit about the need for bird conservation. I'm sure most of us know that there's a lot of birds that have real issues, but I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about citizen science in general, and a brief summary of some of the most important bird surveys. And then I'm going to talk about the breeding bird survey. And sometimes people are confused because obviously any survey of breeding birds is a breeding bird survey, but I'm referring to the North American Breeding Bird Survey, which is a formal international survey. And so that's going to be the bulk of the talk, and I'll talk a little bit about its history, kind of data that's collected and how that's done, the skill level that's needed and the time commitment required, and talk a little bit about current participation, and then examples of how the data is used for conservation. And I'll speak a little bit about training and support relation to the breeding bird survey, and to some degree for all citizen science surveys. So I said I was first of all going to talk about the need for bird conservation. Well, fairly recently, there was a paper that came out, The Decline of the North American Avifauna, and it's sometimes referred to as the 3 billion birds lost paper. So it was published in Science, and you can see the link to the paper if you'd like to look at it. And it showed that the number of birds has declined across North America by 29% over the last 50 years. So when they were doing this particular analysis for the vast majority, 82% of the species they looked at, they came to their conclusions based on the breeding bird survey data alone. So obviously very critical data for assessing the status and the trend of most North American birds. So here's some more specific stuff from that paper. So they showed that there were huge losses in grasslands, boreal forest, and by generalist birds. And the grasslands alone, there were 700 million birds lost in the last 50 years. So that's pretty serious. So the paper did receive a very big media following, and the American Bird Conservancy created a website, 3 Billion Birds, and a Twitter handle, Bring Back Birds Back, to promote the paper and call for conservation. Now, they show 7 simple actions to help birds, and I have to climb on my grassland bird pulpit and say that I don't know why they would say that you need to drink shade-grown coffee and then not tell you that you should be eating grass-finished beef. As important as drinking shade-grown coffee is, and I do drink shade-grown coffee, it's also important to eat grass-finished beef. So grass-finished beef is beef that spends pretty much its whole life on pasture. And in doing that, of course, it helps to keep grass intact. And the argument is sometimes made that, you know, there's gases given off by cattle and that somehow that's harmful to the environment. But what nobody seems to mention is that when they are grazing on grassland, the grass reabsorbs those gases, so it's not a problem. And also that grass is as good or better than trees at storing carbon. So we really need to conserve our grasslands for many reasons, for carbon reasons, but also without a lot of grassland, the grassland birds will be in even more trouble. So sorry, get off my soapbox, pulpit, whatever it was that I was on. So the North American picture of bird conservation and the problems birds are having. And the State of Canada's Birds report came out in 2019. It was released by Environment and Climate Change Canada on behalf of the North American Bird Conservation Initiative Canada. And it's also available online, and it summarizes the population status of the almost 450 species in Canada relative to 1970. And again, it highlights the key actions we can take to help restore Canada's bird populations. And it found fairly similar things. You can see that grassland birds are in big trouble on their grass as well in Canada. So waterfowl have increased, birds of prey have slightly increased, and this is thanks in part to successful investments in conservation like the North American Waterfowl Management Plan and changes to pesticides so that raptors could recover. But shorebirds, grassland birds, and aerial insectivore populations have all declined dramatically since 1970. So this is important because and then take informed action together, we can bring about conservation. And the understanding the problem is where citizen science and the monitoring programs I'm going to talk about come in. So what is citizen science? Well, simply put, it's a partnership between volunteers and professional scientists. So in theory, the citizens collect all of the scientific data, but in reality, sometimes the professionals participate in collecting data. And then the scientists analyze the data and examine the results. And again, there often actually is an element of citizens being involved in helping to analyze the data and examining results because they may have insights that professionals do not have. Altogether, working together, it makes for more efficient. So to be effective in trying to determine what's happening, why a species is increasing or decreasing, and maybe what we could do about it, we need 3 kinds of information. We need distribution of the birds, whether that distribution is changing, and even distribution of habitat and whether that is changing, although that's not a topic I'm going to talk about tonight. Productivity and survival rates will tell us a lot about where the problem is in the species life cycle. Is it because they're not reproducing? Is it because, you know, on their first migration, many of them are being killed? Is it things like that. Are they maybe not even surviving long enough to migrate? And then last is the trends, because that tells us whether the species is going up. So there are a lot of citizen science programs, and I'm not going to speak about all of them, but I do want to touch on some of the ones that we know can produce the most and the highest quality data. So for distribution, there's bird atlases, the Christmas bird count, checklist, which started off as a paper checklist. It's now an electronic survey called eBird, nocturnal owl surveys, and Project Feeder Watch. Now, as I said, there are more programs than these, but these are the ones I'm going to speak to. And most of these collect more than just distribution data. But at this time, we don't have good established trend methods, trend data analysis methods. But for some of them, it's very close. For checklist, I believe it's extremely close. Going on nocturnal owl survey and Project Feeder Watch trend information. And then for Christmas bird count, the limitation is more just that many of the birds that it works, we don't have that many birds that overwinter here. So we have only a small number of birds for which we have trend data. And the trend data is, it's not very precise. So then we have productivity and survival rates. So Project Nest Watch started off as as nest record schemes. There was one in each region, and the one here was the Prairie Nest Record Scheme. And they began in the 1950s, and across Canada. And the one for the prairies was when there began to be issues with the museums were the caretakers, and they did not have the personnel to be able to keep it up. And so there was a move to try and make it electronic. And I worked with Nature Alberta, and we entered a lot of the existing nest cards. It hasn't yet been used to make comparisons for changes in, say, productivity, but it has been used for something else that's quite important. Environment Canada, working with Birds Canada, we looked at a key set of a group of species for each type and looked at their range of nesting dates and fledging dates, and determined periods when we created calendars that basically tell industry when they should not be undertaking development, because it will have a basically 100% chance of disturbing birds, which is technically against the law. So that's one thing that's already been done with it, and there's much more that can be done when we are able to look at changes in productivity. So then banded bird returns, that alone, that tells us something about how long birds live, where they may be dying. Birds that are banded here say where they may be dying. We do already have banded bird atlases based on that, but there are other kinds of analyses that can be done. And it also tells us, how long they live, which is quite important. And then monitoring avian productivity and survivorship is a very important program, because it tells us a lot about what's happening year to year in the bird's life, and also in the first few months of a bird's life. And it's very intensive. There's a lot of work for just one data point. So it's quite a bit of work, but it's extremely valuable data. And trends. So we have trends for some of the northern breeding species we get through the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network. We basically get the information as they're passing north or south, and we are able to calculate trends based on that. And then the breeding bird survey, the North American Breeding Bird Survey, which is the main focus of tonight's talk. So in reference to these surveys that I've referred to, there's a number of ways you could look at them. One of them is at what level can you participate? So if you're started birding, and you may not know a huge number of birds yet, there are a couple of possibilities: Christmas bird count, Project Feeder Watch, and eBird. That's because in the case of Christmas bird count, you're with others, so it's a great opportunity to learn more birds while identifying the ones you do know. And your data is part of a group, so the fact that you don't know all the birds doesn't necessarily preclude you from participating. With Project Feeder Watch, there's fewer birds that you have to learn, and usually they sit there long enough that you might have a chance to identify them even if you don't initially know what they are. And then with eBird, it's something that works for all skill levels. So you can begin using eBird, giving data to eBird when you just know maybe a few species. And as you get to be a better birder and can identify more species, you're start right from the beginning participating in eBird. Surveys that are a little harder, the nocturnal owl survey is harder because you definitely are only identifying birds by their sound. You would normally have to travel some distance from home, and it's a more regimented way of collecting the data. There's certain things about timing and how long you're at each spot and how long you can play recordings and that sort of thing. That's all regimented, so it's a little more effort. And then breeding bird atlases, you have to have a minimum number of hours on any given square for it to be considered to be covered. So it's a bit of concentrated effort in one place, and obviously in that case you need to know more species to be able to do good coverage of an atlas square. Project Nest Watch is a little harder because you have to be able to identify the birds, and the females are not always as easy to identify as the males, and you have to know how to search or how to handle being around a nest without causing harm to the bird. And it's just and repeated visits are the best, because the most valuable data is for a nest where there is more than one visit. So it's a little more effort. The hardest ones are migration monitoring, monitoring avian productivity and survivorship, and the breeding bird survey. Well, the first two are harder for several reasons. One is you have to learn how to ban birds, so you need to be able to, you have to know how to capture them safely. You have to have a permit to do that, and have that permit, you have to have a lot of skill. And so you have to acquire this knowledge about how to capture them safely, how to handle them safely, how to identify the species and do the age and sex. And so it's a lot of work. And as I mentioned before, there's often a fair bit of work just for a single data point for any given species. And then the breeding bird survey is hard because you have to know all the species that you are expecting to encounter by both sight and sound, and it is a very regimented survey. You have to do it in a particular way. There are restrictions on weather and various things. It's time limited. There are a fair number of rules and codes and things that you have to record as you're going. So it's hard work, but it produces very, very high quality data that is very useful. Basically, having looked at this group of surveys, if you want to contribute to citizen science, it's also a matter of when do you have the time. So some of these are available all year round, like eBird, and others begin early, like owl monitoring, and then go through the seasons, finishing up with Christmas bird counts at the end of the year. So if you can't help with the breeding bird survey, then I will hope that you would try contributing some citizen science data through another survey. So now I want to concentrate on the North American breeding bird survey. So, people's concerns began way back when, 1962, when Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring. And so Chandler Robbins from the U.S. Geological Survey and some of his colleagues developed the North American Breeding Bird Survey in 1965. And I just have to say that Chandler Robbins is an amazing man, and I just noticed it's spelled on this picture there. I met him when he had been retired for, I don't know, 15 or 20 years. He was still going into work all day, every day, because he had so much more he still wanted to do. And he was still doing the breeding bird survey until very, very late in his life, until health absolutely prevented him. He was very dedicated, a very inspiring man. And Tony Erskine from the Canadian Wildlife Service brought it to Canada the very next year. So in 1966, it began in Canada. And our former coordinator, Jack Park, was one of the people that he recruited, and he did his first route in 1966 here in Alberta. So that's how it all began. So the Breeding Bird Survey today is an incredibly successful program, and it is indeed the foundation of all water and land bird conservation for North America. So it's been instrumental in, making us aware of issues with neotropicals, grassland birds, aerial insectivores. It's helped us to establish population objectives and to measure our progress in trying to get to those objectives. And it spurred research, it spurred planning, and a great deal of conservation action. And there are literally hundreds of published research papers based on the Breeding Bird Survey. So the Breeding Bird Survey actually now extends into Mexico as well, but I'm just going to concentrate on the roles of the US and Canada in our Breeding Bird Survey that we do here. So the US manages the overall database, and they coordinate the US surveys that happen. They do analysis and publish results, and I've got the website there that you can see those results. They provide a small online training module that you need to go through before you do your first survey. And they manage the data entry system for both birds and for the stop location. The Canadian BBS office in Environment and Climate Change Canada coordinates the Canadian surveys. They enter scan data if people fill out their sheets and it needs to be scanned if people aren't able to enter it online themselves. They do manage quality control of our data, and they also do analysis, and results are published on the website shown. So the data that is collected is the abundance of breeding birds, and the skill level is very high because you do need to know the birds by sight and by sound, and it requires a lot of dedication. Not just to do a single survey, but for it to be effective, you need to do the survey year after year for at least 3 years, but hopefully much longer. So just some notes about the data. The routes are randomly selected. So what that means is the starting point is randomly selected, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a second. An important thing to know is that this route is set up, and a lot of times people are frustrated. They'll say, oh, well, there's somewhere much more interesting that's just, a few miles away. Why can't I do that? In order to make the best possible use of the data, to extrapolate, interpolate, whatever word you want to use, to the whole of the country, the routes do need to be random. And they may become less interesting through time because the habitat's changing, the road gets wider, whatever. And so that can be discouraging, but we really urge you, don't give up on it just because it's getting a little less interesting. Because if you do that, say that's because we are losing birds and habitat. If you give up, then we are going to underestimate the loss of birds, the loss of habitat, because you've stopped just when the data is getting at its most helpful in a bad sort of way by telling us how things are going down. So if it's getting boring, please keep on going. I have one that's very boring now, but I keep on doing it. Another very important thing to note is it's not a complete count. You only have 3 minutes at each stop. And unless there are extremely few birds, you are not going to count everything that's there. Because even if there's only a few birds, they may not sing or be seen during the time you're there. So it's not a complete count. You don't need to, and I know this often worries people because they'll say, well, I know I didn't get everything. Don't have to worry about that. What you have to worry about is putting in an equal effort year after year and getting a similar kind of slice of what's out there, what's really there every year and at every stop. If you do that, the survey works. It's an index. It's not a complete count, it's an index. But it means that it's very important to stick to the rules and perform your data collection consistently in order to make the data the most valuable. So data collection, I mentioned it was randomly located. So what happens is there's a random number is used to generate the starting point. And once that starting point's been randomly selected, then there's another random number, and that tells you which direction to go, or when they're laying out the route. Not you yourself, the route's already been laid out before it's given to you, but this is how they do it. So it tells them it tells them which direction to go in, and then it tells them what way to deviate if the road can't keep going in that direction, because like it's not unusual that you're going to have a T intersection or something, and you're going to have to go one way or the other. So there's a random number to help with that as well. So it's completely random, and it's 50 stops, approximately a half a mile apart each one. So the route is about 24.5 miles long, or 40 kilometers in today's lingo. There are 50 stops, and you listen and watch for 3 minutes at each stop. The survey is done once a year at the height of the breeding season. And the starting time is a half an hour before sunrise. Well, it's not a half an hour before sunrise that exact day. It's the average sunrise time for that month and minus a half an hour. So that part is given to you. They tell you exactly when to start. And it has to be done under favorable weather conditions. And that's because weather conditions affect either how much the birds sing or how likely you are to be able to detect them if they are singing. So if the wind is blowing really hard, they're not going to sing as much, and the chances are you can't hear them. If it's raining, again, they're not going to be singing and you can't hear them. So there's a lot of restrictions about the weather conditions, and you do need to record what those conditions are at the beginning and end of the survey. And I would say in terms of a time commitment, it's at least 2 days per route, because you need to travel there. You need to preview the route, especially the first time that you do it. And you need to make sure your stop descriptions are still correct, because sometimes something has changed or disappeared. And then you need to actually run the survey the next day, return home, and enter the data. So it's at least 2 days that you're going to need to give to do this route. And it would be more if the weather conditions turned out to be bad and you had to return and do it again. And as mentioned before, it does require a high skill level. And the volunteers are the backbone of this program. They're observers and assistants made up of volunteers, paid staff, and contractors that participate in the survey each year. About 40% of these people have been volunteering for over 15 years. So there's a few people that we know here. There's Ian Halliday and his assistant from Calgary. Somewhere there's Jack Park, and there's me. And there may be some other people from Alberta that I don't necessarily recognize, and I apologize if that is true. So they did a questionnaire to participants in 2019, and about half the participants responded. And what they found shows that there's more male than female observers, and the vast majority, 86%, are volunteer observers, and almost half are retired or semi-retired, and more than half are older than 55 years old. And there's a little bit more information broken down over here. Similar information, just shown a different way. But about a quarter of participants said they would continue volunteering for the next 15 years. So that's very encouraging. But we do always need to find new observers, because some people have to drop out every year for various reasons. So we need to keep finding new observers. And you will notice, if you look at that circular graph, that pie chart, that there's not very many young people participating. Well, part of the reason for that is because when people maybe are first done university or early starting off in their working careers, they may have to move around a bit. They may be very busy with other things, and they may not be able to participate, even if they have the skills. But as people move on, maybe become more settled in a given place in their career, then they begin to participate. But obviously, it would be great if we could get some younger people so they could have a very long career with the breeding bird survey. So something for this questionnaire was the top 3 reasons for running them. And, a lot of people said that they really did want to contribute, and that's fantastic. Many of them saw it as a fun challenge, and many of them were interested in looking at, tracking a particular place and knowing what was happening in that community. The top 3 reasons people did not run their route were sometimes other commitments, the distance to travel to their route, and vehicle traffic on their route. Now, if traffic increases too much over time, if it becomes dangerous, then we can change the route. But we try not to change the route unless the traffic becomes very heavy, for the reasons for it can lead us to maybe underestimating what's happening if we change a route or create a new route in response to vehicle traffic. Now, the 4th reason that's not listed there for people not to run their route is sometimes frustration. So people who are very skilled birders, they know their birds better than I do, I'm sure. But they're not necessarily used to doing something that's regimented. They go out birding and they go where it interests them, and they follow where they hear birds or see birds. They just maybe stay longer or go from there to another favorite spot. Whereas with this, it's more regimented, and that can be frustrating. And as I mentioned before, you have only 3 minutes at each stop. So you may be frustrated because you're not getting everything that's there. There's a lot of things that you have to be keeping track of, and you have to put it on you have to record it on forms. And there's just a lot of things that are a bit different from regular birding, so that even though they have very good skills, they may still find it frustrating to do. So that's part of the reason that I really want to make sure people realize how important this data is and what it does for bird conservation, so they will hopefully find ways to fight through that frustration and keep participating. And I'm going to talk a little bit about training at the end, and that can help with reducing the frustration. So I mentioned participation. So it started off with just about 10 routes, or maybe 20 routes, back in 1966, and it's climbed up to around 600. And the last couple of years are not shown on this chart, but in 2020, obviously, the breeding survey season was canceled due to COVID, and in 21, the results are still actually coming in. But there have been at least 475 routes run, which is pretty fantastic because there were still restrictions. And, not everybody might have been willing to go and stay in a hotel and eat in restaurants and so on. So some people may not, because of COVID, still have been able to participate. So that's pretty big if your people were to get back out there. So the contributions that have been made are 55 years approximately of population data with all that information, the trends and relative abundance, a lot of point counts, almost 100 million bird sightings, and this is the breeding bird survey altogether. And of that, all that data, 20% about is Canadian, and the data is heavily used, which I've mentioned before, but go look at. So the Canadian website provides data and analyzed results at various scales and regions and time periods, and the results are available and accessible to the public on the Government of Canada website. And you can do some custom analysis of your own with specific time periods and so on. There's information on on the trends. So it tracks the indices through time, and you can see the trends. And these are just some example species. It also provides trend maps. So this is the map isn't going to be exactly the same for each bird necessarily, but they're groupings of routes that are sufficient to be able to do a trend for that grouping of routes. And you can see that even a species that might be going down, like the barn swallow, is doing very poorly in some parts of the country, and it's actually slightly increasing or around neutral in other parts of the country. So that's another interesting result that you can look at for and I showed this before or something similar to it. The state of Canada's birds then has group level trends, and then there's other information as well. There's details on the status of all the bird species, gives long-term population goals and the status in relation to that goal. And it tracks the quality of bird monitoring in Canada and describes the most pressing conservation issues for each species. So that information is all there. As a result from the survey, basically look different. We're declining, increasing, staying about the same. And the breeding bird survey is critical for decision making. So it's used by all kinds of conservation and land use managers. It's used by scientists and many organizations. It directly and indirectly contributes to every stage of the conservation and management cycle, from identifying the problem to trying to figure out what's causing the problem to try and come up with some actions to turn those problems around, target, and then to evaluate whether or not we're reaching the targets. So it's used in many ways, all illustrated here on this pie chart. And one example, which I haven't mentioned before, is down here in the lower right, is COSEWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. For most bird species, the major decision-making data comes from the breeding bird survey. And the target is based on that, and then the assessment of whether or not progress is being made in recovering the species is based on the breeding bird survey. So it's used a tremendous amount in research. So there's many topics for which it's used. And this graph, again, it is in 2019, but it shows there's been more than 800 peer-reviewed publications that the bird survey, and then those may generate new questions and new kinds of research. So I just wanted to give you two examples of breeding bird survey related papers. One is a paper that I myself was involved with, and that was the monitoring as a means to focus research and conservation, the grassland bird monitoring example. And what we did was we were developing grassland bird monitoring. We used the exact same technique as breeding bird survey. So everything was the same, right down to how we selected the route. The only difference was we only put routes into degree blocks where there was still a decent amount of grassland remaining. That doesn't mean the route, because it's random. The route may not fall within any of that grassland, but there's a higher proportion of grassland in the degree block, and therefore it turned out there was a higher proportion of grassland on the routes. We compared the trends on grassland bird monitoring and breeding bird survey routes for the grassland species, and some species had better trends where there was more grassland. So things like Swainson's hawks, ferruginous hawks, long-billed curlews, loggerhead shrikes, they all did better where there was a lot more grassland. And that might indicate then that their problem is elsewhere is habitat loss. But other species like Baird sparrow and Sprague's pipit didn't do any better or almost did worse where there was more grassland. And since we know from other studies that they are more productive where there are large blocks of grassland, then that probably points the finger to the problem for those species being on the wintering grounds or during migration. So all of this kind of thing, it directs research, and as a sidebar, the grassland bird monitoring is now included in the breeding bird survey. So they do analyses with it. And here's another paper, very recent, 2021, where they looked at variability in barn swallow population trends across Canada, and they found that they were not related to reproductive performance. So they were looking at, they got data from a lot of nest colonies, and then they looked at whether or not in the following years, whether that reproductive performance related to the trends. And they found that neither colony size or breeding success was a good predictor for the breeding bird survey trend in the following years. And again, they thought that might indicate a need to look at wintering ground or migration survival. And they also had, through their analyses, they were able to determine that food during the breeding season was not particularly limiting. So another good and interesting use of the breeding bird survey. So in summary, I hope that the participants realize, if they didn't before, the value of the contribution that they have been making. And for non-participants, I hope you realize what citizen scientists are contributing, and I hope you're inspired to participate in one or more of the survey programs I've spoken about, and especially, of course, in the breeding bird survey, if you're able to. We do have some vacant routes, the ones shown in red in Alberta, and almost half the routes are vacant. We have 4 routes per degree block, so it's a lot of routes. And if you're interested in a route, there are 2 email addresses there you could contact. One is me, and the other is the National Breeding Bird Survey Coordinator. And either one of us will be able to get you started. If you want to find out about the birds on a prospective route, if you go to the USGS Breeding Bird Survey site and you click on one of the links on the front page is vacant routes, and then you select Canada and Alberta, and then if you go through it takes a minute or so to come up. It's quite slow, so don't be put off by that. Then there'll be a list of routes, and the ones in red are available, and you can select a potential route. And if you click on information, beside it there's a button that says information. One of the things that will come up is a list of the species that have been recorded on that route. That'll give you an idea whether you know the birds that you would need to know to do the route, or what few you might need to practice on, or whatever. But it's good information when you're trying to select a route. Not only are you looking for where it is, obviously you want one as close as possible to home, or maybe in your favorite habitat far from home. But then this is one more piece of information you can use in selecting a route. And also actually in training yourself, because it tells you what species you need to learn. So training and support, I think, are very important, because if you increase people's skill level, it improves their enjoyment of birding, as well as the quality of the data in the surveys. And it's important to be properly prepared to collect that data to the highest possible standard, and to avoid being frustrated. So I am willing to offer BBS training module sort of thing, a little workshop, to provide background on the instructions, because I think that if you know why the instructions are there, what scientific reason there is for those instructions, then it makes it easier to follow the instructions. When otherwise, sometimes you may think, why do I have to do it that way? Well, there is a reason. So I think it helps, it makes it easier for you to follow the instructions if you know why the instructions are there. Some safety tips, some tips for writing your route description if you don't already have one, that if your route doesn't come with a good route description, or maybe even for making the route description more helpful to you. Some tips for recording the data, information about acronyms if you're not already using them, because they certainly speed up data collection. And then tips for step-by-step building up so that you take your regular birding and can move it to being able to do 53-minute point counts starting really, really early. So you might be starting at 4:30 in the morning. And that's the first tip, which I can give you right now, is if you start getting up a little bit earlier every week as you get closer to the breeding bird survey, then when you get to that morning and you have to get up at 4 o'clock or 3:30, it isn't a shift of 3 hours, it's maybe only a shift of an hour. And it's not so physically difficult so that you're not standing out there just feeling utterly exhausted. It makes it all a lot easier if you're not feeling exhausted. And this little workshop that I would do could be useful for assistants as well. For everyone, for any, obviously there's a lot of apps out there for learning birds, identifying birds, but this is one that I like to talk about. It was developed by the Canadian Wildlife Service, and it is presented as a co-product of the Canadian, American, and Mexican conservation agencies. And oh my God, I'm sorry, my dog is snoring so loud that you could probably hear her. The website has two modules, one for birding and one for banding, and the birding one is Dendroica, and it has multiple images for each species and multiple sound bites for each species. So you can learn a lot. You can, if you join up, you create custom lists so you don't have to look through all the birds to find what you're looking for. And then when you think you've gotten it figured out, then you can do a quiz. And what it does there is it will randomly play the song of the species in the list that you've created. And then if you correctly identify it, then it will present the picture. But you have to do the ID with just the sound and not the picture. So it's a nice little test. I personally use it a lot to warm myself up at the beginning of the year, beginning of the birding season, just to make sure that I do remember all the songs. I want to thank you for your interest in conserving birds, and I hope your interest in participating in citizen science. Thank you for listening.